Hello, I'm Zahra. I'm here with Eleanor Gilburd, and today we are here with Rachel Applebaum, who is the author of Empire of Friends, Soviet Power, and Socialist Internationalism in Cold War Czechoslovakia, which has just come out with Cornell University Press. And we're here to have a conversation with her about the book and her research and her thoughts on the Cold War more broadly. So could we start with maybe just a question about what brought you to this topic?
Sure. Well, kind of strangely, this book about Czechoslovakia for me began in Hungary, where I spent a semester about 15 years ago in Budapest at Central European University. And I had been kind of immersed in Russian history and studied Russian language from high school. And being in Budapest was really my first kind of prolonged exposure to Central Europe. And I was just really interested by the traces of Soviet power that I could see in the city. They were still using the Soviet cars on the metro, and there were Russian inscriptions at the bathhouses and on the trains, and the monument to the Red Army that was just a couple blocks from Central European University in the center of the city. And I became really interested in thinking about kind of the differences between contemporary Russia and Central and Eastern Europe, but then the sort of roots of that during the Cold War and what the encounter between the Soviet Union and Central or Eastern Europe would be like. And so ultimately I ended up writing the book about Czechoslovakia because it's such a dramatic story, Soviet relations with Czechoslovakia during the Cold War, and frankly it was a little easier to learn Czech than I think it would have been to learn Hungarian. But that's the genesis of the project.
So you just mentioned the monument to Soviet soldiers, and much of the book takes place, and much of the story that you tell takes place in the aftermath of war and kind of in the shadow of war. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the place war, plays in this story,
Mm-hmm.
and how that place changes over time. Because you're looking from the immediate post-war period up through really this later 70s.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really kind of long and dramatic 3.5 decades that you're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so only really toward the end of writing my dissertation did I realize the central role that the war plays in the story of, the broader project that I was looking at, which was the development of kind of socialist friendship between the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia throughout the Cold War. And so the Soviet Army's liberation of Czechoslovakia in 1944 and 1945 was the foundation of that post-war friendship project. And that was the moment when there were these spontaneous encounters between Soviet soldiers and Czech and Slovak civilians. And for the Soviet Army, and for both sides, it was really a seminal moment. For the Soviet Army, they lost an estimated 140,000 soldiers during the liberation of Czechoslovakia. So of course it was very important for that reason. It was also the final feeder of the war after 4 horrible years. And on the Czechoslovak side, they had been under German occupation for 6 years, and so the liberation was the end of that. And there were these spontaneous encounters, soldiers kissing local women, and the image that's on the cover that I really love of, locals presenting bouquets of lilacs to the Soviet soldiers because it was this time of year, it was May, when they reached Prague. And that spontaneous encounter then became this much more kind of sterilized official friendship project, and was used actually during the Stalinist period to justify the Soviet Union's hegemony over Czechoslovakia. We lost these soldiers, we spilled our blood, we did this so that you could build a socialist society in our image. And it was really after Stalin's death in the late 1950s that Soviet veterans on the one hand, and then Czechoslovaks who had encountered those soldiers during the liberation on the other, in a lot of private letters that they sent to the government and also publications, in official newspapers and magazines, started to challenge that hierarchy, and to talk about how the Soviet veterans would say, we are actually indebted to these Czechoslovak civilians for having saved our lives, that, we were wounded and they took care of us, or we remember the warm reception that they gave us. And that became a way of partially overturning that hierarchy. And then there's another phase that happens in this kind of legacy of the liberation in 1968. So one of the reasons for the Soviet invasion in 68, there was a rhetoric about how challenges to this kind of Soviet version of socialism that were coming from the Prague Spring reformers were a kind of affront to the lives of the Soviet soldiers, who had lost their lives or sacrificed their lives. And then when the Soviet army, invaded in August 1968, and so for the second time in 23 years, there are Soviet tanks rolling down the streets of Czechoslovak cities, resistance in Czechoslovakia often took the form of talking about this dichotomy between a benevolent liberation in 1945 and a violent occupation in 1968, so that played a role on the one hand in challenging the Soviet invasion, but on the other hand, it actually kind of reinforced this somewhat, overly, kind of gossamer view of the liberation that had been told throughout the communist project.
Well, could I take you back, actually? I mean, this kind of, in some ways, takes me back to the question of why Czechoslovakia, because obviously it's a really dramatic story given the dynamics of both the liberation and the occupation in 1968. But it also seems like maybe it's a somewhat unique story within the world of Soviet satellite states. Could you say a bit more about why Czechoslovakia is such an interesting and sort of unique case?
Yeah, for sure. So I think, first of all, the structure of the friendship project that I describe in the book, these friendship societies that existed, the Soviet Union sending its films and its literature to the satellite states, tourism, all of that structure was pretty much the same for Soviet relations with all of the Eastern Bloc countries, and also provided a blueprint later on to try and extend that friendship to Asia, like to China and to Vietnam, and as well to, African countries that might go socialist. So that structure is kind of the same. How it operated in each country, I think, is a different story, and it's often a story that, I think remains to be written. On the Czechoslovak side, I think what's unique is, first of all, the kind of unevenness of this relationship. So there was a long history in Czechoslovakia, and then going back to the Habsburg Empire, of support for Russia in terms of Pan-Slavism, Russians as the sort of older Slavic brother who might, help Czechs to gain independence from the Habsburg Empire. And then at the end of World War II, there was a special sympathy for the Soviet Union in Czechoslovakia that in part was related to the 1938 Munich Agreement. Czechoslovakia had, before the war, had a foreign policy that was largely oriented on, gaining favor with the Western European countries and establishing themselves as a kind of Western European country itself. But there was a lot of disillusionment after Munich, where France and England basically allowed Hitler to occupy the Sudetenland, and then from there he went on to occupy the rest of Czechoslovak territory. So that was seen as a betrayal in Czechoslovakia, a betrayal by the Western Allies, and really turned to, make a lot of people pivot toward the Soviet Union and say, well, the Soviets are our true ally, they haven't sold us out in this same way. And there was also a lot of organic support for socialism after the upheaval of the war and 6 years of occupation, and changes in who the elites were, etc. So all of those conditions, and then with the liberation, and the fact that in large part, it was seen as a liberation, whereas, in Hungary, in Germany, it was seen as an occupation. Poland, basically,
Right.
lots of other places. So all of those, I think, made for unique conditions. In some ways, this was the best case for friendship, I think, that existed in Central and Eastern Europe. But in other ways, it was a very unlikely friendship because Czechoslovakia was so much more westernized, wealthier, industrialized than the Soviet Union, which was ostensibly its model.
Can I follow up on your central vocabulary and your central argument about friendship? So you have the institutional structure of these friendship societies, which are replicated in many other places, and one of the kind of key terms that you introduce is empire of friends, right? So just wondering if you could, and of course in the Soviet context, domestically, Soviet nationality policy is about the friendship of the peoples.
Yeah.
Is it the same kind of friendship, or is friendship here used differently? Or, is it the same kind of folklorization of culture that we see, or of ethnicities that we see in the Soviet Union? Does the term assume some other connotations when it goes abroad? So if you could talk about friendship kind of as a Soviet model of building relationships across the world, but also sort of domestically.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And absolutely, I think there is some link to the fact that there was this domestic Soviet project of friendship between the different Soviet nationalities that began in the 1930s. But I think that project was much different with Eastern Europe because there's a difference between, what is ours and what is foreign. And friendship with Eastern Europe was always about foreigners. And so certain, and I'm not an expert in this, but my sense is that there were certain ways that friendship between the peoples of the Soviet Union were encouraged, especially like in the post-war period, intermarriages, for example, which was the very opposite in this broader friendship project with the Eastern Bloc. So the Soviet Union did have this very ambitious student program where they brought in about 10,000 foreign students from the Eastern Bloc and East Asia to study in the Soviet Union during late Stalinism. But at that exact same time, they banned Soviet marriages to foreigners. So you had all of these foreign students coming in, and they're actually told that the purpose of them being in the Soviet Union is to, make friends with Soviet citizens, but they're not allowed to marry. And, it's sort of what goes unsaid is that they're not really supposed to be having any kind of romantic relationships at all. And there's, tourism within the Soviet Union, would be encouraged. It is somewhat encouraged in this project with Eastern Europe as well, but only on these carefully scripted package tours. There's a lot of fear, and I think this fear comes more from the Soviet Union than it does from Czechoslovakia, of kind of what happens if people go off script in this friendship.
The friendship goes too far.
If the friendship goes too far, and that is one of the themes in the book. I think is the tension between kind of state versions of official versions of friendship, and then how they're interpreted by ordinary people, and the intimate relationships that they form, and how those often become actually counter toward what the state wants. So the state wants a certain kind of friendship, but they don't want that friendship to actually become too intimate.
I'm just thinking as you were talking about the Soviet lens on the world at large as friendship, because they also have, right? They also use the term for Western fellow travelers, right? For various progressive authors, cultural figures. These are friends of the Soviet Union, and so it's this sort of friendly brotherhood, leftist brotherhood on the one hand abroad, and then domestically it is friendship, but also they have familial, right? Because it is, the big Soviet family, right? So they have these familial connotations that don't easily translate into, foreigner.
There is some rhetoric with Eastern Europe about brothers. That's sometimes a word that's used, brotherhood. But it is, clear that it's, as it would be in the Soviet Union, also the Soviets are clearly the older brother here. But I think that friendship is the broader term that's used rather than brotherhood.
Could you say something about what most surprised you in the course of your research? If there's anything that you expected to find that you didn't, and how your own ideas evolved over the course of either researching or writing this book.
So I think two things surprised me. I mean, one was that I didn't intend for this to actually be a book about friendship. I mean, originally I wanted to write a history of Soviet expatriates in Czechoslovakia, or the sort of Soviet colony that existed there of journalists and diplomats, and I just couldn't find that in the archives. And then I thought, well, okay, I'll do this sort of history of social and cultural relations between the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia. And it was only when I started going through the archival material that I saw this term coming up again and again, friendship, and at first I thought, oh, well, it's just sort of, this kind of propaganda term. But then I discovered, well, there are all these ways that they're actually really trying to encourage, these forms of friendship, whether it's, through these student exchanges or through tourism or pen pal correspondences. And I just thought that was really interesting and surprising, given, what I knew about Soviet relations with Eastern Europe, which was about political oppression and military force. And so obviously both those stories are true, so I wanted to understand how did they coexist. And I think the other thing that surprised me once I did realize that it was going to be about friendship was that this friendship project with Czechoslovakia continued even after the Soviet invasion in 1968, and that really both governments, the Czechoslovak government and the Soviet government, tried to kind of keep on implementing the project more or less in the exact same way that they had been doing since Stalin's death. And that really surprised me. But this really was a project that more or less lasted until 1989.
So on some level, I mean, your interpretation of this kind of friendship project or the project of socialist internationalism more broadly differs from those before you in the sense that you seem to be arguing on some level that it succeeded. Is that right?
I mean, I think that well, first of all, the work that had been done, and there really wasn't that much, but on socialist friendship in the Eastern Bloc was almost entirely on the Stalinist period. And that is the period where, for sure, it's the most hierarchical, it's rhetoric about friendship, and yet great fear about what happens when there are any kind of form of personal contacts. It's very much a unidirectional project of Soviet cultural transfer and political transfer to the satellite states. But what I found when I went beyond the Stalinist period, again, I think something that was surprising was how much this project changed over time, how flexible it actually was, and changed in conjunction with kind of broader political, social, and cultural processes in both countries. So I think there's an argument about success in that, the fact that it did last through the entire socialist period and it did change in all of these ways. But I also think it's the project's impact on everyday life where we can see its success. And success doesn't mean that people, liked it or really believed in it, but they participated in it, whether or not they believed in it. And often they participated in it in unconscious ways. They participated in it by buying products from the other country. They participated in it by going on tourist trips. Those may have been the only opportunities to travel abroad, but they went on them. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people did. They participated in it, by, if you were in Czechoslovakia, learning the Russian language. Again, that was obligatory in school, so it doesn't mean that you enjoyed learning it. But it became a part of the fabric of everyday life, particularly in Czechoslovakia. But I think in the Soviet Union, at least it was a part of people's everyday life, having some, friendship tied to some socialist bloc country. It may not have been Czechoslovakia in particular, but the fact that, and people often tell me in response to this project, people from the region, who are old enough to have lived through it, often the first response is, well, no one believed in that, that was just propaganda. But then they usually say after that, I do remember that I had a pen pal in the Soviet Union, or I do remember that I took a trip to, the Black Sea. And so it was a part of their everyday life, even if they didn't kind of believe in the political ideals behind it. And I think there's an element of success in that.
If I may add, as you were talking, I also have two memories. As a kind of former little Soviet citizen, and one of them are the red trams, which were all over in Soviet cities, right? And the trams were produced in Czechoslovakia, and they were everywhere, and that's one of the ways that it kind of came into your everyday life, right? Wherever you go,
they were from Czechoslovakia.
and you knew they were from Czechoslovakia, and in fact, we on our way out of the Soviet Union, we were traveling by bus to the Austrian border, and the last time things felt home was when those red trams, right? And we were well past the Soviet borders, but seeing the red trams still felt like we haven't yet gone too far, right? And only when the sight of those trams disappeared did I know as a kid that we're no longer home. So home kind of was a bigger thing. And it did include those material objects. And the other thing was the really prized Czech furniture that my parents got, at some point, and it was a really precious it was difficult to part with it. It was a beloved kind of, it covered the whole wall, and it was a beloved thing, and people admired it, and they commented in it. So that was one of these very special ways in which your everyday life, in material terms, right, was surrounded by Czechoslovak objects. And just recollecting some of this.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned, the furniture, and the consumer goods aspect of this story was again kind of surprising for me because, yes, I mean, Czechoslovakia had a kind of more advanced consumer culture, and my sense from what other people had written was that Soviet citizens kind of discovered this by accident, and this was a part of tourism that then the Soviet government was kind of like, whoa, we've gone too far. Now they're seeing that people in the other socialist countries may in some cases live better than we do. But actually I realized that a part of this friendship propaganda was actually highlighting Czechoslovakia, or showcasing it as this kind of model socialist consumer society. And in fact, kind of flaunting the fact that they had more advanced consumer goods than the Soviet Union did. And so in 1959, when there's the famous American National Exhibition in Moscow at Sokolniki Park, Czechoslovakia simultaneously holds an exhibition at the Manege, in central Moscow by the Kremlin, of its glass products. So it's glassware and chandeliers and things like that. And that was done deliberately to detract from the American National Exhibition as a kind of, this is good consumerism. This is from a socialist country, and by buying these products, if in fact you can really get a hold of them, you're sort of contributing to our communal socialist economy and to our socialist values, as opposed to some American, vacuum cleaner that has values that are antithetical to us.
One of the discourses in the Soviet press at the time was that the American stuff is sort of mass produced and all alike, and the Czech, the stuff, the glass from Czechoslovakia is artistry, right? And it's sort of this it's unique and it's individual, and this kind of special labor goes into it rather than mass production. And so now that you brought up the American exhibition, I was wondering if you could talk about the American presence throughout the book, because it's one of the earliest chapters. Really, you triangulate the Soviets and the Czechoslovaks, and then the American presence in various ways in the late 40s. And then it kind of disappears for a while, and then it reappears again in a really important way as well.
Yeah, so the first chapter of the book is particularly looking at this sort of the opening salvos of this kind of cultural Cold War in Czechoslovakia. And the Soviet government, their kind of beginning of the friendship project was to basically try and kind of bombard Czechoslovakia with Soviet culture, particularly films, where they actually signed an agreement right after the war's end with the Czechoslovak Ministry of Information that they were going to occupy 60% of the screen time in Czechoslovak cinemas, something they were never actually able to do because they didn't produce enough films. But they were sending a variety of cultural goods to Czechoslovakia, and one of the reasons was that they really saw Czechoslovakia as kind of on the front lines of this emerging Cold War with the United States. And the U.S. Hollywood films had actually been the most popular films in Czechoslovakia before the war. I mean, more popular than Czechoslovak cinema. And so there is, in the first chapter, I talk about this kind of cultural Cold War, where the Soviets are sending all these films. The U.S. eventually starts, sending Hollywood movies, and that immediately makes people go see fewer Soviet films. But what I think is so interesting is that even though the Soviet Union and the United States both believed that culture was an important way of kind of inculcating politics, inculcating their own politics in Czechoslovakia, neither of them in this initial phase, which was like late 40s, were very successful in this project. And they were both stymied by domestic events. So in the United States, the commercial organization that was in charge of exporting films didn't want to deal with Czechoslovakia because they had nationalized their film industry. And the State Department initially felt like it's not our job to tell a commercial organization what to do. And they were also worried in the United States about domestic anti-communism and not wanting to do too much culturally in Czechoslovakia, because if you're really going to have cultural exchange, you'll have to invite these people to the United States, but they're communists, and there was a law against admitting communists into the country. And in the Soviet Union, of course, one of the ironies of this opening phase of the Cold War was that it coincided with the most stringent anti-Western campaigns in the Soviet Union, the Zhdanovshchina. And so they were also kind of afraid of actually having too much contact with Czechoslovakia. And so what happens is that it actually falls to the Czechoslovak Communist Party to promote the Soviet Union in Czechoslovakia. And that sets up a pattern that exists throughout the book, where the Czechoslovak Communist Party, they're always promoting, they make the majority of the propaganda for the Soviet Union about Czechoslovakia, but also for Czechoslovakia about the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of unexpected. And the United States, I'm trying to think where it came up again in the book.
In the later 50s.
Yeah.
And 60s.
So again, it was
returns.
Yeah. So again, it was at that point where, in this kind of new consumer phase of the Cold War, where Soviet officials are sort of actively pointing to Czechoslovakia and the other countries of Eastern Europe as a kind of ideological, acceptable alternative for, an outlet for consumption. That it's good to buy goods from those countries in a way that, it's not good to kind of covet those goods from the United States.
I think we are about out of time, but before we finish, we were wondering, of course, everybody should read your book, but if you had any other books that you would recommend to viewers wanting to learn more.
Yeah, so I mean, I was told to choose 3 books that I liked, and none of them are really related to this topic. My first book is Plutopia by Kate Brown, which is, I just think, a fantastic book about the Cold War, and incredibly well written about nuclear disasters in the United States and the Soviet Union. And it's just a book that you want to kind of stay up and keep reading. And I see it as a model for historical writing, one that I certainly cannot replicate, but that I really admire. The second book that I chose is Out of Egypt by Andrei Aciman, which was written in the 1990s, but I just read it last year. And it's just the writing just kind of blew my mind, and I would find myself reading the same passage over and over because it was so beautiful and evocative of his, lost childhood in this Jewish world in Alexandria in the 1950s, and made me want to travel to that place, even though I realized it doesn't exist anymore. And then the final book that I chose was All Dressed Up for a Riot, which is Michael Edov's new book about his experience working for the Russian version of Vanity Fair. And it's really about politics, contemporary Russian politics, and Moscow specifically. And it kind of answered some of the questions that I have as someone who frequently travels to Moscow and wonders about the disconnect between politics and the way the city is sort of increasingly becoming more joyous and, more cafes and parks, and he has some really interesting answers to that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.